dollar dipping slightly for the week, but up close to 5% in the last 6 months. That's a trend that is proving to be a headwind for some mega cap earnings this quarter so far. Our Deirdre Bose is looking ahead to the potential impact on Amazon tonight in today's Tech Check. Morning, Dee.
Hey, good morning, Carl. So the Magnificent Seven, of course, they generate substantial portions of their revenue overseas. So when the dollar strengthens as it has, those foreign sales translate into fewer U.S. dollars when they report. That hits earnings. We've seen that from Meta, Microsoft, and Google a few nights ago. It's likely to be a headwind when Amazon reports tonight. But Forex headwinds, they will impact big tech to varying degrees. Here's where each of their international revenue exposure stands and how it has changed over the last year. Now, as you can see, and we'll pull up this graphic, Apple and Meta, they are actually the most exposed in terms of how much revenue they generate abroad, nearly 2/3 for both of them. NVIDIA is next with more than half of its revenue derived internationally, but it's also seen the most change in that makeup. Last year, it increased its U.S. revenue exposure by 44% year over year, thanks to export controls and the hyperscalers' enormous ramp in CapEx. Amazon actually has the least exposure, with just about 30% of sales coming from abroad. These numbers, by the way, are from FactSet. Still, continued dollar strength could significantly impact guidance like it did for Meta, Microsoft, and Google. And what may be different this time are those elevated levels of trade uncertainty introduced by the new Trump administration. The U.S. dollar has seen as a safe haven amid those tensions, and that's certainly been the case. Combine that with the relative underperformance that we've seen from Microsoft and Google's cloud units, a strong dollar, that can shift competitive dynamics in the longer term for them, especially for contracts that are denominated in USD, making them more expensive for international customers. Now, the street is expecting AWS revenue to grow 19% year over year. If it comes up short, we could see more concerns about AI adoption and ROI, especially as those CapEx plans continue to climb higher, despite how DeepSeek, raised a bunch of questions. As we look ahead to NVIDIA, guys, I spoke to an investor who actually doesn't think that dollar strength will hurt its international sales anytime soon, because tech companies outside of the U.S., he says they're going to buy as many chips as they can before tougher export controls go into place. The bigger concern, he warns, is later in the year when we might see more CapEx digestion. Back to you.
Yeah, it's always a question. Usually the investors give these companies the benefit of the doubt if the miss is on currencies or that sort of thing, because it is beyond their control, although I guess they could be better at hedging. I think one of the bigger sort of international risks that we're contending with, and I know we've talked about this, Deirdre, is the rising protectionism and trade fights, and now using antitrust policy, potentially by the Chinese, who mentioned Google, and there was a report on Apple, and ultimately what that looks like as a risk for some of these big tech companies going forward, and how investors should weigh that.
Absolutely. And that is very much showing up in that foreign exposure. I mentioned it with NVIDIA. It increased its U.S. exposure by some 44% over the last year. I was looking at Apple as well, and so interesting. I mean, its exposure to China declined 10% in 2024. And that's, talking to exactly what you just pointed out, some of that rising protectionism. And certainly in China, we've seen them become a little more aggressive in terms of hitting back at Apple. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything for Google, but for an Apple, China is such an important market, and Huawei has been gaining steam. That is so critical, and that's what investors, are looking at more than sort of those Forex headwinds.
Yeah, we were thinking about what Goolsbee said yesterday, Fed governor arguing that maybe this round the tariff dispute might last longer, might be more intense. And if China is serious about using corporates as one of the arrows in their quiver, Dee, that could become more significant than we were used to back in 2018.
Absolutely, and that all feeds into dollar strength. So we'll continue to see this play out for Amazon. It's interesting that it isn't as big a factor. It used to have a China business, and it retreated a number of years ago. So it kind of tells you still what we've always known, is that China is a risky market for multinationals, probably now more than ever.
I mean, always in Europe, these companies would get investigated on antitrust grounds, and Americans would cry protectionism, right?
We got used to it, though.
But in Europe, there's, at least Margaret Vestager, who said it wasn't protectionist. She said she just wanted everyone to play fair. But you can really use these policies in that way.
Right. And with Europe, it's been kind of essentially speeding tickets, right? It's been these fines. They've gotten tougher. But when you look at that revenue makeup, especially for, the China piece of it, for a company like Apple, that is more significant than anything that Europe could do.
Yeah. European Commission now asking Shein for some internal documents and detailed information on illegal goods and content. It just keeps going. Thank you, Deirdre.